Talk about focus groups right now. So focus groups are characterized as an unstructured, free-flowing, laid-back group interview. They were developed after World War II to gain insight into audience response to radio programs. And so one of the histories of focus groups and audience research in general, such as like A.C. Nielsen Company and the ratings, is that popular culture makes its money on advertising. And so one of the really important things as commercial radio emerged in the post-war period was being able to determine who was listening, how many people were listening, and why they were listening, so you could develop similar programs that would also be successful. And so focus groups are generally used to help us understand how and why people hold certain beliefs about a topic. So there's several different types of focus groups. One is exploratory. It helps us define research problems and generate hypotheses. They can be clinical. We probe deeply into participants' psyches. Or based on experience. And so you might reveal product or brand usage, attitudes, and beliefs. And so, for example, I participated in one of these experience focus groups where I was given a new mascara to try for a week. And after a week, we came back and reported on how we liked the wand, what we thought about the product, would we use it, would we buy it, what would we pay for it, and so on and so forth. And so focus groups are good for information about how people feel or think, insight into why certain opinions are held. They're good for improving the planning and design of new programs. They're used to evaluate existing programs and to develop strategies for outreach. They're not so good for valid information about individuals. People are in public. They might not always want to reveal everything about themselves. There's different ways in which we behave in artificial situations that would change. Focus groups also don't give us a lot of information about how things might change over time, such as opinions or attitudes. And not good, again, for information that can be generally applied to other groups of people. So there's 3 phases of focus groups. One is conceptualization. Then you move to the interview, and then you do your analysis and reporting. So conceptualization, that's the preliminary step where you determine why you're going to conduct a focus group. Why are you doing it? Who are you going to do it with? Then you're going to want to develop a plan and estimate resources and specify a procedure, timeline, and proposed budget. Moving on to the interview phase. This is where you actually do the work. You want to develop questions. You usually want about 5 to 6 questions, definitely less than 10. And you're going to use open-ended questions. You don't want yes or no, because they don't lead to any interesting answers. So rather than, did you like the program? Which is, sure. What did you think of the program? Right? And you want to avoid a why question. Those imply a rational answer, and obviously they're, and it encourages people to kind of limit themselves. Why do you like that? Oh, I really like that actress. Okay, but where else can you go with that? And so thinking about things like how or what, or very open-ended questions that are going to really stimulate thought among the participants. So you want to have questions prepared, but you want to allow for a natural flow. The idea is to get a conversation going. And so moderators should be able to sit back and guide the conversation, but they don't want to input their own ideas. And you want to allow for unanticipated questions. So while moderating, a good moderator is key to a successful focus group. You want to, if the topic gets offhand, be able to guide it back to relevant topics. There's also often a team approach that's taken. So you have an assistant taking notes and so on, observing people, trying to decide what role they play in the group dynamic. And then the moderator directs the discussion, and that opens up the moderator simply be in the moment and follow the conversation as it goes. And so general pattern to the discussion, you've got the welcome, overview and topic, a laying of the ground rules, and this would be things like no name calling or everything's anonymous, or it would really depend on the topic of the focus group. And then you'd start off with the first question. So some of the do's while conducting a focus group, you want to pause and probe. You want to pay attention to group dynamics. And so you might have someone who's a dominant talker. A good moderator would find a way to sort of move the conversation along from their statements and encourage other people to speak and contribute. So, how do you get the shy one to participate more? Bring the rambler back to the topic and kind of deal with the expert who thinks they know everything. Another thing is be prepared for the unexpected. People are weird, and you never know what's going to happen when you go into like a live situation. And then you want to record the discussion, take notes, have it taped, and so on and so forth, so you can refer back to it later. Because remember, similar to the other qualitative methods, when we take our notes, we don't want to note, we want to separate our impressions and interpretations from what actually happened and what was actually said. And so you do want to note things like tone, sarcasm, excitement, and so on, but you also want to have the direct writing done. So some of the don'ts, you want to avoid head nodding, and you want to avoid short verbal responses. So as a moderator, and this is different than when you're interviewing, as a moderator, you don't want to go okay or yes or uh-huh, because that might lead participants to think about, to think that you're agreeing with one particular participant's point of view or statement, and it might then lead them, keep them from generating more creative ideas or speaking honestly about their thoughts. Okay, so for focus groups, your participants are purposefully selected. They all have, you want people in the focus group that have information or ideas relevant and related to your topic of study. So you don't want to just grab 5 people off the street and have a focus group. That's not going to work out very well. And so focus groups are homogenous, but you want them to be varied so that you have different opinions and can get a conversation going. Ideally, you have about 7 to 10 participants. And one strategy with focus groups, particularly in market research, is to continue conducting focus groups until little new information is provided. And so you do one focus group, then another, then another. After, say, 3, you look at what you've got and, see what new themes are emerging. And if by, focus group number 4, you're getting the same ideas you've had in the first 3, you've pretty much covered the content. Okay, so while doing a focus group, both the moderator or the assistant would be taking field notes. And so you want to make a list. You'd list any changes and questions, participant characteristics, descriptive phrases or words used. You want to pay attention to how people describe things. Do they make analogies? What adjectives are they using? And what themes are in the responses? And so if people reply and over across several focus group participants, you get the same themes emerging, that you have something to work with. And then you want to look at sub-themes. So points of view held by participants. Do they have an agenda or particular point of view that they're trying to put forward? Because again, that's going to help you interpret the results more accurately. And so if somebody's got a particular end game, so the case study I'm going to go through comes from my previous life, but we were working with a home and garden store in the suburbs of Chicago, and we were looking for, we interviewed both customers, employees, and management, and conducted focus groups. They were looking to build their brand identity, and this was as Home Depot and those larger big box stores were entering the market. And so you want to think about, if an employee had a particular, issue with one particular manager or had, they were consistently advocating for a particular policy, you want to not discount it, but also kind of be able to interpret it within that lens. And so you also want to think about the consistency of participant views with behaviors. And so one of the things to keep in mind when we do research, especially like strategic comm research, is that we don't always, behave consistently with our viewpoints. And so I'd be, for example, strong advocate for organic and non-GMO grass-fed beef. And yet sometimes I can't always afford to buy that fancy beef. And so, or it's more convenient to pick up the stuff from the grocery stores. So, the consistency of my views with my behavior, there's some inconsistency there, and the reasons why then for a researcher would become very interesting. Or, for example, if you were working for the Organic Meat Foundation, right? Why would someone who would like to eat organic not? So on and so forth. And so this is from the chalet example, and we've got, this was a home and garden thing, and we're looking at, what you're looking at now are some raw notes from a focus group session. And so we have a list of, these are the managers. So who is, this was our overall project that we explained to the clients. And then this is a summary of who we had in the room. And then we asked them to write down their first answer. And so the first question was, how is chalet described to a new neighbor? And so we asked them to write it down. Why would we do that? We want them to begin to find their own voice. And again, if you have a dominant talker or an expert, or a particularly, some sort of power dynamic, you don't want to have somebody emerge right away, answer within the first 10 seconds and say, oh yeah, it's this. And then everyone, it's easier to just say, oh yeah, what that guy said. So you want to avoid that so you can get everyone's perspective. Another question that we used, our second one, was, it sure would be nice if. And so you get a pretty consistent, set of things that emerge, but you also have, these are projective techniques. We're asking people to project. We're not asking them how they've described it in the past. We're not asking how they've heard it described. It's how, this sort of imagination. Imagine that you're describing this place to a new neighbor. And what, in a perfect world, would they do that they don't? This is a note sheet from a focus group with full-time employees. And so with this focus group, we were looking at what they could do to serve their customers better. And we wanted to think about what it was like to work there. What did the employees go through in their daily life? This, again, is a list, quick notes about who we have and how long they've been there. And then we asked the new neighbor question, which by now the internal team was familiar with, so we just wrote this. And then here are some responses, right, about what they think they do well. And so, and what they think they don't do so well. And so one of the things here to bring up is also the importance of confidentiality, because you can imagine that employees aren't going to feel particularly comfortable speaking their mind in a lot of cases if they know management might find out about it. And so the ability to guarantee and secure anonymity for participants becomes important even in doing strategic comm research. Right. So this comes to Kate is a great example of this. Right. So the question was communication. What do they do well? What do they do not so well? And so Kate's very upfront telling us that after 6, 10 to 14 hour days, she's a complete bitch. And so you can see how she's being honest, and that's really useful in conducting the work we were doing. But you want to be sure to be able to not turn to the manager and be like, oh yeah, Kate admits to being awful. Another thing, the awfulness of the employee of the month, that theme emerges and everyone kind of jumped on it in the focus group. And so this gives you a sense of how the employees are feeling. And now if you're thinking about a branding campaign or how to increase, business at a company, you want your employees to be happy, right? They're the front line. They're the people are interacting with. And so the group I was working with, the perspective we took was that the employees often know more about the product and about the brand than the management do because they're a little bit further removed. And branding should come from what you're already doing well, and you should strengthen that. And so this is what those focus groups were trying to get to. Okay, so you saw some of our raw notes, and that's the reporting part of it, right? Then we're going to look for descriptive statements and interpretation. And so you want to consider 5 factors when you're doing your reporting. and coding. And so one of them is words. Meaning should be determined, frequency counts, and you'd cluster similar concepts together. And so you want to make sure that when people are using words, you understand how or why they're using them, especially in a business environment where you might have a lot of internal company jargon. Secondly, you want to think about the context. And so what was the triggering stimulus for particular comments? And then be sure to trace the flow of the conversation. What led to what other statements? Where did the conversation take a variety of turns? And then you want to be really attentive to specific responses. And so oftentimes we'll be like, we prefer to know something about something based on experience rather than just, oh, I thought, or I would do this, right? No, like, what have you done? And so experience is examples of things with experience have more weight. And then you want to find the big ideas and see what cuts across the entire discussion. And so this is an example, if the link is going to work, of a data coding sheet, right? And so we've got the group affected. We've listed out the themes, right? So hours come up quite a bit. Off-site visits, right? And then we've got a quote. So this is directly from who said it, what session they were in, and this is a statement made by someone. In the nursery, they want to pay and go. The landscape manager was worried about the maintenance teams. And so you get a sense of how this coding was going. Landscape versus retail. Confusion about divisions was a big issue. The landscape versus retail sections of the store, and then various problems, right? And this is coming from landscape customers, staff, and so on. And then again, looking at employee satisfaction. Here's what HR sent. Here's what the management relation teams sent. Burnout as a theme, and so on. And so that's an example of what a data coding sheet looked like. And as we continued to do the research and begin to clean it up and polish it to present to the executives, we refer back to that to see what themes emerged. And that was sort of a way of guiding our thinking about what to recommend and what sort of brand identity they might have that we could build on. Right? And so the analysis portion, when you analyze data from focus groups, you want it to be verifiable. Others would arrive at the same conclusions. And so you'd want to look at that data and be able to say, oh, wow, we really have a problem with this or that, the other. You're losing customers, or you risk losing customers because the offsite visits are too expensive, and so on and so forth. And so you want to observe that. You want to be sure to look at participant interactions. Again, that helps you interpret what the dynamics of the group are. And immediately after the focus group, you'd want to spot check the tape recorders or video. And then you'd want to write down summary comments, right? Some brief ideas and thoughts about how things went, what emerged to you, what seemed to emerge to you, and so on, before you'd go back to the video. And so a few ways of dealing with the videos or tape recorders are you would transcribe all of it verbatim. That's a word-for-word list of what was said and who said it. You might note important parts where themes emerge, like listen to it again and note, like, oh, minute 5, that's a really good quote. Minute 10, that's a good quote. And then you can only transcribe those sections. That's a time saver. And so there's various ways of dealing with the comments afterwards. And so this looks like summary notes after the employee focus group, right? So employees had grievances. We've made it kind of nice. We've cleaned it up a little for presentation. So rather than call it just saying that they work too hard and don't get enough praise, they aired plenty of grievances, but their longevity with Chalet is counterintuitive with their voiced unhappiness. And so you don't want to be completely negative ever when you're, either in a job interview or presenting information to a client. But you do want to say that, be honest about what's happening, because that is a problem. The grievances is a problem. And again, this also goes back to thinking about people being consistent with their behavior. Are they, do they have, they have grievances, but they've been there for 8 years. And so what's going on there where there's something about the job that is keeping them there? And can you grow that while addressing their grievances? Okay, and that brings us to our next methodology, which is interviews. And so the goal of interviews are to provide in-depth information about participants' experiences and viewpoints on a particular topic. And so when coupled with other data, they provide a well-rounded collection of information for analysis. There are 3 formats for interviews. One is the informal conversational interview. Another one is the general interview guide approach. And then third, we have a standardized open-ended interview. And so the informal conversational looks like a conversation. You walk up to someone, you're curious about what they're doing, and you begin to ask questions about it. Now, in a research setting, that's going to be much more systematic, even if it remains informal. But you might also think about like an informational interview if you had to do one of those for your classes in the past, right? You're looking to get information from somebody who has a career or a job that you might be interested in, and so you go about asking them some questions. Number 2, the second type of format is a general interview guide approach, and so that's where you're using a brief guide to make sure you hit all the topics you want to talk about, that you don't get off track or in the moment forget to ask about one of your central themes. But it's very loose and you're still kind of doing a very informal, casual interview. And then number 3 is a standardized open-ended interview. And this takes the place usually of like a job interview. When you interview for a job as a professor, for example, there's standardized questions that every applicant is asked. They're asked in the same order, and there are no follow-up questions allowed. And so that is, so you've got this very kind of standardized, your answers are going to be open-ended because they're questions in an interview, but there's not going to be really a big change in theme or what the questions are because they're standardized. So informal conversational relies on the spontaneous generation of questions. The questions often come from in-the-moment experiences. It relies on interaction with participants to guide the interview process, and you're kind of working off the top of your head. Meanwhile, the general interview guide, it's more structured but still flexible. The questions are worded based on who does the interview, so you can play to your own. If you're on a team, you can still word the questions to match your own personal style and conversational approach. And so it's adaptable. And it's ensuring, though, that the same general areas of information are collected from each interviewee. And so this is an example of what a general interview guide looks like, right? Tell me about your experience. And you want to make sure that you can get, that you can move on that. Like you want to touch on how was your booking, arrival, the house that you stayed in, and so on and so forth. Right, and then if you have time, here you can ask these extra questions. And so that was a guide done. We had several people on a team doing interviews, and the guide was created to help make sure everyone asked the same general areas of information. And that made data collection and analysis much easier because you did have at least some standard themes that were touched on to look at. And so, as mentioned before, standardized open-ended interviews, there's a very structured wording of questions. You're allowing participants to fully express their viewpoints and experiences, but you might have difficulty coding the data. And standardized open-ended interviews reduce researcher bias within the study. And so that's why they're done, as I mentioned before, often in hiring. You don't wind up with, oh my gosh, the interviewer and the interviewee went to the same college and spend their whole time talking about their fraternity. Right, as opposed to somebody else who has to do the what tree would you be question. Right, and so you're reducing bias in that way and standardizing things across the board. So this is more of a um, standardized thing, like what do you think customers would like to see, and so on and so forth. And so while interviewing, make sure the tape or, phone or whatever you're using is working. You want to ask only one question at a time. You want to remain as neutral as possible. And so you do, if you're doing this face to face especially, you'd want to encourage responses with a head nod to let them know you're listening and interested in what they're saying. But you don't want to look, judgy. You don't want to look at some point like, oh, that's a good answer. Ooh, I don't like what you're saying. So you also want to be careful at your appearance while note taking. So they say something, you don't want to hurriedly and angrily jot something down. When you're giving your questions, you want to provide transitions between major topics. And overall, you don't want to lose control of the interview. You don't want to kind of let the conversation wander so far afield that you're taking the interviewee's time and not getting the information you need. Because when conducting interviews or focus groups, it's important to be very aware of the time that your respondents are giving you to conduct your research and to be very respectful of that. So this is what coding a semi-structured interview looks like. These were the clients that we interviewed, and this is some of their responses. And then we went through it after the interviews were conducted and came up with some ways of marking. These are the themes. What's their first comment? We thought that the first comment really carried a lot of weight. What are they talking about? The price? Are they talking about furniture quality, the competition? And so in doing this, we can then quickly sort through and see what people said about the competition. What did people say about the delivery or pickup service? And so on and so forth. Okay, and so finally, that helps with interpreting the data, which is when we make sense out of what was said. Because, of course, if research was as easy as asking questions and then telling other people what was said, it wouldn't be research. It would simply be reporting. And so research involves interpretation. And so you've got to compile the data into themes or codes, which is what we saw back here. You're going to look for consistent phrases, expressions, or ideas. And you might, in some cases, use a third-party coder to reduce bias. And so that would be, you take the transcripts of the interviews and you give them to another person who up until now has been uninvolved in the project, or to another interviewer, so that you trade people you spoke with. And then you get a more objective, or at least blinded, interpretation. And so this is another example of, we broke this out through customer categories to see what differences existed based on, this was a furniture rental company. And so we wanted to know, how did their needs and experience with the company vary depending on what their position was. So home sellers would use Brook to rent furniture to stage their homes. Accident and disaster victims needed homes and they needed to rent furniture while their homes were being repaired. Transferred employees, again, have a different set of needs and a different sense of urgency. And then the entertainment industry would use it for, other parties, location shoots, the government, temporary homeland security assignments. And so these were, what was most important to them, right? We organize that up by category. What are the drawbacks? And then who's deciding, on these purchases and who is using it. Because the decider and the user and the payer aren't always the same person, as you can see in here. And then finally, you want to create a final report. You want to be certain in making your final report that your findings and recommendations are justified by your data. And so here you can see we were discussing the website and noting some general, from the exploratory research or in-house research. 3% of your web traffic is international, but 12% of your web leases are international. And so you have a higher conversion rate, and a conversion rate is when people go to your website and take the action you want them to take. And so for Amazon, a conversion rate is not when I just go there and do a search, but it's when I buy something off of Amazon. When I go to a different website, perhaps they want me to sign up and create a profile. That's a conversion rate. For this company, they wanted people to lease furniture. And so 12% is actually a pretty high conversion rate, especially if only 3% of your traffic is international. And so the you also have only 7% of your business coming from the internet. And so to kind of work through that, then we looked at our focus groups and interviews and saw, some of the problems. And we used specific quotes from clients and employees, right? About they don't use the website. Peter thought that it was good. It's easy to help someone with a general quote. And he hasn't even been to the showroom. And, when I did a furniture search, their name didn't pop up. And so this suggests with some pretty clear evidence, because we're quoting the respondents back to management, what the issues with the website are. And that would help guide us towards thinking about what steps to take to really maximize the website's traffic and use utility for clients. And so that summarizes the focus groups and interviews portion. We're going to talk about ethnography next week, and enjoy your week. And please email me with any questions. Thanks.